is Anugrah Rao, and I welcome you to the 10th episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Million Lights. Million Lights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning HTML5 application development. And this is the second episode of this course. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science, and those who are interested in coding, app development, etc. can join us as well. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. As we already told you, that these courses are not only beneficial for students but also for working professionals. If you are looking to get started with web programming in HTML5, we are sure that these episodes for professional development, which provides a fast-paced and comprehensive introduction to learn HTML5, can definitely help you out. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Colin White, Supervisor of IT Academy programs from Microsoft with us. He is going to talk about how to create an application with HTML5. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with 64-bit processor or 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous episode, we covered 3 modules: the application lifecycle, building the user interface part 1, and some portion of building the user interface part 2. In this episode, we will cover the remaining part of module 3, in which we will learn tables and lists, input and forms. Module 4, CSS Essentials Part 1, in which we will understand the core CSS concepts from the HTML5 App Development Fundamentals exam, find out what cascading style sheets are, how to use CSS with HTML5, and how to position elements on a page. And Module 5, CSS Essentials Part 2, in which we will learn to arrange user interface content by using CSS from the HTML5 App Development Fundamentals exam. Explore the UI and how to organize page element using the CSS box model and grid layouts. So let's get started.
Let's take a quick second to go ahead and do a quick demo so that you guys can see all of these things in action. So here we have our semantic demo. I'll just open this up real quickly for you. Notice that we've got our navigation element that we just saw and a couple slides back, and then here we have an article. The reason why I wanted you guys to see this page is so that you can understand that these elements, they don't just make something appear like this, right? Like this image on the right. There's a lot of extra work that has to go into making a web page appear the way that it does. And so it's super, super important that you don't just make the assumption that these semantic elements just structure a page and make it appear the way you want it to, okay? So let's go back, go back to Web Matrix here, and I'm going to go ahead and right-click my HTML document, launch in the browser, and there we go, right? Everything is just line after line after line. Note here that our H group element doesn't impact the way that things look on a page at all. Looks just the way that it would if it was never there. But I know that those belong as a group. All right. Okay, let's transition. Let's talk about tables and lists really fast, super fast, in fact, okay? All right, so if you're creating a table, you're going to want to use the table tag, another semantic markup, right? You use a combination of all these other tags in order to add your rows, your columns, and everything else. Use the TR tag to create a table row. That's what TR stands for. You have the TH tag is table header. It's going to create headers. TD tag. I'm still trying to figure out what D means, so if anybody knows, go ahead and definitely send me an email or follow me on Twitter. It's always a good thing to do. Next, if you want to style columns in a particular way, you can go ahead and group them together using the call group element. And then, of course, we have different ways to mark groups of headers, header rows, footer rows, the body, and then also providing a caption. I'll show you how to use a couple of those things here in just a second. So let's take a look at what this code looks like in a browser. So bear with me as we go back to Web Matrix and open up Table Demo. All right, so note here that I've got a caption. Maybe I'm working on my graduate thesis in addition to working 3 full-time jobs, and I really want to make sure that I'm keeping track of all the hours that I'm working. Well, here I've got a table with a border, so I'm using the border attribute of 1 in order to make sure that we outline our table. And then I've just got the first row, which is going to be the header with month and hours. Then I have the second row, which is going to be April, which is the month, right? Notice how those match up. Then 100 is the number of hours that I worked. And then I've got my third row here for June. So I clearly did a lot of work in April, not very much work in June because it's beautiful and sunny outside, like 80 degrees. And then in July, I've got to buckle back down because, well, it's going to be due in August or something along those lines. Anyway, let's go ahead and pop that demo into our browser, and you see how that table is formatted there, right? So pretty cool stuff. We got our caption up top, number of hours worked on thesis. Let me snap that over here. And then we have the month and the hours. Pretty self-explanatory, but tables can be confusing to work with, so if it does take you a little bit longer to figure out, don't be too hard on yourself. It's definitely just sort of harder to read than some of the other markup that we use, okay? So, all right, back to the presentation. Lists. There are 2 different types of lists that we could add into our HTML documents. We've got ordered and unordered. Ordered lists use the OL tag, and they order items in a list using numbers, right? So it's numerical order. So you check out that example on the right of an ordered list of my favorite foods. Number 1 is pizza, and number 2 is cake. It can be a little confusing because you're not going to see 1 and 2 there. You're going to see LI, which stands for line item, or sorry, list item. But do know that it'll appear as number 1 and number 2. That's not actually my favorite food list. I just thought everybody would be able to relate to it a little bit more. All right, next we have an unordered list, okay? UL tag, the UL tag is used to display items in a bulleted list. Once again, we add items to that list using the list item tag, the LI tag. And so if I'm visiting Seattle, then I have a to-do list, right? I want to make sure that I visit the Space Needle, and I also have to buy a rain jacket because everybody here thinks it rains. It's 80 degrees outside right now. It's nice, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at lists in action in a demo, okay? All right, so let me pull up the list demo. Note here, we've got our 2 different kinds of lists. Keep that in mind. I'm gonna go ahead and launch here in the browser. And there we go, right? Pizza's number 1, cake's number 2, my Seattle to-do list. I've got Space Needle by Rain Jacket, no particular order. Doesn't matter which one I do it, so therefore I'm gonna use bullets. Pretty quick and easy, right? Lists are definitely not too challenging or too confusing. Still can be a little tricky though. All right, let's go ahead and transition and take a look at input and forms. A web form is a page that features input fields where users enter data. Form input, or that data that's supplied by users, is sent to a server where it's processed and stored. And we use these forms everything. They're super ubiquitous. They're all over the place. We use them to sign up for newsletters, to complete surveys, to make purchases and enter our credit card information. I mean, they legitimately are in almost everything that we do. Every single time that we enter in a username, like our login credentials, we're using a form. Super important, right? There's a graphic on the right there of a form, just in case you've never seen one before. But if you haven't, you're probably lying to us and yourself, more importantly. All right, so if you want to create a form, guess what? You're going to use the form element, right? There's semantic HTML in action again. we create a form using the form element, and then inside we're going to nest our input and our label tags, right? The label element is going to display a label for each field. So, in our example that we just saw, we had a field for our first name, and we should probably label it so people know what kind of text needs to go in it. We've got the for attribute here so that we know that the label is for the input tag with the name, first name. So notice how these match up. That's super, super, super important, okay? Next, we have our input element here, right? The type is text, which means that people are going to go ahead and type in text. It's just going to be a blank field that doesn't have anything in it. And similarly, we're going to use the same style for our last name input box, and then also our email input box. Notice here, though, that for first name and last name, we've got text and text. And then for, pardon me here. All right, then for our email box, we're going to use a different type. It's going to say email. It's for a particular reason, which we'll get at in just a second. So there are a lot of different types of input, right? So we just saw email and we saw text, but you can also make the value of type. You can set it as password, right? For passwords, set it as submit to create a submit button. We could set it as radio for a radio button, checkbox for checkboxes, dates for dates, like today, which is June 22nd, 2015. And we could also add it as a search field. And a search field is going to be very similar to a text box. People are going to be able to type in text that they want to search for, right? I love semantic HTML. It makes teaching so much easier. All right. There are a couple of other different attributes that we want to be able to use with our input elements. We're going to use the autofocus element or autofocus attribute, the required attribute, and then the placeholder attribute. Okay. Autofocus is going to bring focus to a specific element. So if you have a form on a web page, it's going to highlight it, right? So if you have a box here, it's going to go ahead and it's going to highlight it in some kind of blue hue behind it in order to say, start with me, I want you to go ahead and enter information here. Required is going to make sure that people enter it. So they go to submit a form, they're going to get a little pop-up box that says, hey, you have to enter something here. We'll go ahead and see what that looks like in just a little bit, okay? And then finally, a placeholder. A placeholder is pretty cool because you can go ahead and insert, I guess what I call dummy text, so that users know what they should be entering and where they should be entering it. I typically use a placeholder in combination with, I'll actually go show you here, with a label, because if I don't, I'm still just always concerned that people aren't going to necessarily know where to go or whether something's going to not render properly. And so it's better to be safe than sorry, unless of course you're going for a very specific style on your web page. All right, let's take a look at this web form demo here, okay? So note the use of placeholders. You're going to see those in action, and I'll sort of show you what we can do with autofocus as well. So let's go ahead and go over to Web Matrix. I'm going to pull up our forms demo, and let's go ahead and take a look at it in the browser first. So it's not very pretty. I'll apologize for that, but do notice here that we have our placeholder text. Here we have the placeholder text set as first name. Let's snap that real quickly here. And you can see that we have placeholder text set as last name, email address, and then also password. If I enter in a password here, like I love Web Matrix, notice that you weren't able to see me entering my password. I can go ahead and set it as visible. And of course, I spelled everything correctly, which is awesome. But here we hide all the characters that are entered inside of a password field. All right. Let's take a look and see what happens if we add in the required field. I'm going to expand this real quickly here. What happens if, let's see, let's say that a first name is required. I'm going to go ahead and save the file, snap it back here real fast. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. So if I enter my last name, White, col.something at example.com, and then I enter in a password. My password here is stuff. Not a good password, by the way. And I go ahead and click submit. Oh, look at that. It says it's a required field and it is highlighted in red. Pretty nifty stuff, right? Pretty nifty stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and head back to our presentation here. We saw everything in action. I want to double check and make sure we touched on everything. Oh, I want to show you autofocus too. I feel like a horrible human being if I didn't show you that. Not really, but I just feel like I should show you that. It's pretty important stuff. Bring that back up. So let's say that we are filling out a form and we want, let's see here, we've got our first name field. We don't only want to make that required, but we want to go ahead and set this to autofocus, okay? So we set it to autofocus. We'll set it equal to whoops. Set it to true. Sorry there. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind, guys and gals, is that you're going to make a lot of mistakes. I make tons and tons of mistakes, especially when you're starting out. Nobody's perfect. And so that's the first thing that I tell all my students. Like, if you make a mistake, it just means that you get to learn more, which is pretty cool. It's the best way to learn, in fact. Unless, of course, you know, you break an arm or something like that. That'd be pretty bad. Let's go ahead and save this file. Make sure it's saved. Gonna go ahead and refresh. And now if I refresh the page, autofocus, it didn't give me that hue that I was talking about, and that might be different based on the browser that I'm using. But what it did do is when I land on the page, it's gonna go ahead and it's gonna place my cursor immediately inside of first name. And if you actually see there where I'm hovering over with the cursor, that's pretty cool. It said this is a required field, right? No asterisks, nothing like that, but definitely some cool stuff with HTML5 and forms. Okay. All right. Let's talk about form validation. You actually already have seen this in action. So validation is a process of verifying that information obtained from a form is in the appropriate format. So sometimes we have issues like an empty field, right? I didn't enter my first name last time. You might have an invalid date, an invalid email address. Maybe you're supposed to enter a telephone number. We've got to make sure that people are actually doing that when they enter their information on forms. With HTML5, we can make this automatic, but in HTML4, it wasn't automatic, right? So here we can do something like this with HTML5, where we say, please provide a valid email address when somebody tries to click the submit button. Now, the type of validation that occurs with HTML5 is called client-side validation. So it happens inside the browser. So it's not going to happen after information has been sent to a server somewhere in California, maybe Redmond, Washington, wherever servers happen to be located. If a user enters the wrong value into a form field, we also want to make sure that the browser instructs them to correct the error. So notice it's not just saying, please provide a valid email address in the little pop-up on the right, or not just provide an email address, but rather saying provide a valid email address. And so here we have jane@live, and maybe that's supposed to be .com or .org, but we can set up a form so that people actually have to enter proper email addresses or telephone numbers. And you do this with the pattern attribute. And the pattern attribute can be pretty complex, but I strongly suggest you go ahead and take a look at Bing. Just do a quick search for HTML forms pattern attribute. You can find a lot of really great information and some tutorials that are available to figure out how to utilize that in order to perform client-side validation. Okay. All right, so it's the end of our Module 3 journey. Just as a quick recap, we discussed semantic HTML. We reviewed tables and lists, how to create both. We talked about how to create forms and how to handle different types of input. Super important, those types. And finally, we talked a little bit about form validation and what happens on the client side. We'll talk a little bit later about how to perform form validation with JavaScript, but that's a little bit later in module 9 or something along those lines. I don't know, but thanks again for joining me. Hope you had a good time. We'll see you next in module 4. Bye. Welcome back to HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. I'm Cullen, and we're about to head into Module 4 and start our wonderful voyage into cascading style sheets. Right now, we're going to go ahead and focus on some basics of content flow, positioning, and styling. And let's take a look at the agenda, actually. Talk a little bit about what cascading style sheets are. Talk about their selectors and declarations. Talk a little bit about fonts and font families, then content flow, positioning, and then content overflow, which is very different from content flow, okay? So keep that in mind. All right, without further ado, cascading style sheets. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is a language that's separate from HTML, and it defines how elements are styled. So in other words, HTML structures a document, CSS formats it. I think of these things as layers. So if maybe if you're building a building, right, HTML would be the foundation, right? So it sits on the bottom. And then you add CSS on top into the exterior because it styles it. Later, we're going to add functionality with another layer called JavaScript, right? And so you can't have one without the other. So you need HTML before you can really apply CSS, and then JavaScript is going to make things move to, typically you're going to apply that after CSS as well, but to each their own on that one. CSS can be applied to single HTML elements, or it can be applied to groups. CSS files are stored as style sheets, and they feature the .css extension here. So you can see up on the screen in this example, whoops, right here, this one is titled example.css, right? Unlike HTML, CSS uses rules instead of tags. So this whole thing right here is a rule, right? That's going to define the style. CSS3 is the version of CSS that was released in conjunction with HTML5s. They're partners in crime. CSS3 is backwards compatible, which means that it can easily be used with older versions of HTML and CSS. There are a couple of exceptions, though. Some older browsers won't properly render HTML that's been styled with CSS3. So do keep that in mind, and we'll touch on that throughout the rest of the presentation. There are a number of new effects in CSS3 as well, including 2D and 3D transformations, and then also animations too. We'll detail all of these wonderful things about the third version of cascading style sheets. First, let's go ahead and talk about how we can link a CSS file with HTML, or how we can just link CSS with HTML, period, right? There are 3 different ways to do it. So one, we have inline styling, okay? So we have our HTML element, P, and we have the style attribute, and all we're gonna do is we're gonna add something simple like color red, right? That's a declaration. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in terms of the structure of CSS. You're also gonna see me throughout this presentation and others using the style element, which is going to be nested inside of the head tags at the top of an HTML document, right? So we can do it inline with each element. We could add it in as a style element inside of the head tags. And then third, we can link a separate CSS file. This is great if you have large amounts of CSS, and it really is how you should be doing things when you're designing a fully functional website. For our tiny little simple websites, we're probably going to do a lot of number 1 and number 2. But if you create more robust websites, you definitely want to focus on the third way of linking CSS to HTML. Okay. just to highlight a couple of advantages of placing CSS in a separate file, you can apply a style change to an entire document, or you can work with the team across different web projects and you can maintain the same style. So I can go ahead and I can share everything that I'm doing in my CSS file with all of my friends who are also building web pages, and then they all use the same style. And that is a really, really cool thing. And it definitely makes your job a lot easier if you're developing web pages or web applications, okay? All right, let's keep on rolling. So let's talk about that link tag a little bit, okay? CSS files are linked to HTML files using the link element. The link element has an href attribute, which is going to point to the file source for the style sheet. It's really, really important that we make sure that our file name and the location are correct, or else none of our style will be applied. We'll keep getting all those simple little HTML pages that we had that just look real ugly and plain, okay? We're gonna use the rel attribute, set that as style sheet, and then we use the type attribute, we set that as text/CSS. This is the way it's done every single time. The only thing that really should change when you're linking a CSS file is maybe the name of the file itself and its location. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and dive a little bit deeper into selectors and declarations. So there are two different parts of a CSS rule. You have a selector, which could be like H1, it could be P, it could be any element that you want styled on a page, or you could use IDs or classes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but a selector, right, is going to reference a specific HTML elements or a group of elements. A declaration, which is the whole thing here, right? We had just talked about that with inline styling. A declaration has two parts. It's got a property, which is followed by a colon, and then it's got a space and then a value followed by a semicolon. So here we have the color property is going to be set with a value of red, and that makes our header turn red. Okay. Declarations, they sit between curly braces too, okay? So keep all these things in mind. Definitely review this slide in the future for reference. HTML elements can be referenced by selectors in a number of ways, right? So we had talked about the actual tag name, but we can also use IDs, and we can use class selectors, right? So up here at the top, we've got the tag name with H1. Here, we've got an ID for a nav bar, where we set the background color of our ID as our ID nav bar as green. And then we can also go ahead and use a class, right, and say that everything in our web page that's happy is going to have a font size of 14 pixels. Maybe we want to set the background color yellow, but anything that we attach that happy class to is going to have those attributes or have those features. ID and class, as mentioned previously, are both universal attributes. So ID is for unique elements, such as you're a unique individual, and so you would probably have an ID if we use them for humans. And then classes are used to categorize elements into groups, right? Just as we mentioned before, if you belong to a class, maybe you're taking Philosophy 101, that would be the class that would be used to describe you. One of the many, probably. All right. Last and not least, we want to talk a little bit about comments. You can add comments to your CSS file to explain what it does. It's going to make your code a little bit easier for others to read and understand. There are two different types of comments that you can add. You can add multi-line and also single line. They both start with a forward slash and an asterisk, and then end with an asterisk and then a forward slash, right? Anything that's between those characters won't be interpreted by a browser. And so you have our multi-line comments up here, and then also our single line comments down here. The only difference is that one takes up one line, and then the other multi-line takes up multiple lines. All right. Fonts and font families. This is one of my favorites because I think that fonts are really critical when we're stylizing a website. Good font can make a huge difference. You want things to be simple and clean, especially on a mobile device. It makes it a lot easier to read. Typically want to stray away from decorative fonts for really small screens. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into fonts and just sort of the general field of typography. So a font is just a set of characters of a particular size and style. The primary way to specify fonts in CSS is just using the font family property, right, within a declaration. And there are three common types of fonts that you're going to see, and that will be tested on the HTML app development exam, right? We've got serif, sans serif, and then monospace. So serif is I guess an example of serif font is Times New Roman, and you can see that there are little decorations on the edges of the letter. I can't circle it because my fingers are too fat, so I apologize. But you can see there with the N, right? You have a couple of different decorations. Same thing with the R too. With sans serif, an example is Arial, and notice that there is no decoration. Like, these are super clean lines, right? Unlike the ones that I'm drawing on the screen. And then finally you have monospace. An example is Courier. We're also using another one, it's Consolas, which is in the in Web Matrix. You'll see it featured throughout our presentations, right? But each of these letters occupies the same amount of space. So it doesn't matter if it's a capital R or a lowercase I, they possess the same width, right? They occupy the same amount of screen space. All right, sometimes you're gonna wanna go ahead and import a font into your web page. And in order to do that, you have to use the @FontFace rule. The @FontFace, excuse me, the @FontFace rule allows developers to use any font as long as it's located on their web server. It used to be the case that we had to use web-safe fonts, but that was basically limited to any fonts that were installed on a user's device. And so if you have all these different devices now, like just tons of smartphones, tons of laptops, tablets, you know, it's kind of a roll of the dice to sort of just make the assumption that somebody's going to possess the font that you want to use on their computer. And so the @FontFace rule is a really fantastic way to be able to access the fonts that you want to use on your website. And here's an example down at the bottom of the screen of how you would implement the @FontFace rule. Use the font family, excuse me, use the font family property, right? Insert the name of the font. And then you want to go ahead and indicate the source of the font that you're using. And that would be in the form of a URL, which is going to just be a link to a web page or happen to be a local file on your computer or on your web server. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the really interesting stuff, like how do we actually style these web pages? Let's talk about content flow, okay? Flow is a display style in HTML that focuses on filling content on a page horizontally in rows. So if I have my two hands, right, and so I'll put them over here so you can see them. If I add an element to a page, it occupies an entire row. If I add a second element to a page, naturally it's going to occupy the second row. They aren't going to automatically sort of appear on the same row, but rather we've got one that's going to sit on top of the other, okay? We can change this using flow with CSS, right? So we have block flow and then we also have inline flow, okay? And actually, let me go ahead and backtrack. I just misspoke a little bit. Not that we use block flow, there is block flow and then there is inline flow as well. So with block flow, you're gonna see block level elements doing exactly what I just did with my hands. And then with inline flow, you've got different content that's going to fit in line with other content. So it maybe you embed an image or something along those lines within a paragraph, and that is going to appear like this little guy right there in our inline flow example there on the right. All right, so let's talk about positioning and how we can change the positioning on a page. floating elements is the first thing on the list. In addition to modifying the flow of a page, HTML and CSS allow developers to position individual elements where they want them on a page, okay? The float property is going to allow you to move an element all the way to the left or to the right of a page here, just like our blue element, okay? The value of float is commonly going to be set to left or right, okay? I want to go ahead and show you a quick example of this. And just a second, we'll come back to talk about clearing floats. So pardon me, I'm just going to sort of diverge from the course. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and show you here a quick float demo, right? So I've got my HTML text down here. Just H1 float demo, right? We've got our header there. And then we've got two divs. I've got one ID'd as block 1, and then the second is ID'd as block 2. The first one is going to appear as a blue block, and I've styled that, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then the second one here is going to appear as a green block. And we're going to go ahead and mess with these two blocks a little bit, okay? Take a look at my style here. I've used the style tags embedded inside of the head element. I've got my divs, both divs, because this applies to all of them, are set to float to the left. Okay. Block 1 and block 2, both are a width of 200. The background color is simply blue for block 1 and then green for block 2, just like we had said. And then I added this attribute here, margin. It's going to add a little bit of space around the two blocks so they don't bump into each other too much, okay? So let's go ahead and pop this up on the screen. And having a couple of problems here, but that's not a worry. There we go. All right, so enlarge the font size so you can see it. It actually messed up my demo. But here you have two examples. You have the blue block and the green block. Right now I've got them set to float left, so blue block floats left first, and then green block floats in between. Now right next to it on the right. If I remove the float property, let's go ahead and comment that out actually. I'm just gonna copy this. If I comment that out and I save and I go ahead and I refresh the page, what happens is I have my first block level element is on the top, and then my next block level element is on the bottom, just like I had shown you earlier with my hands, okay? Super important to keep in mind. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove these comments, and we'll go back to our presentation to talk about clearing. So sometimes you're going to float an element to the left or to the right, and you aren't going to want other floating elements to touch the left or the right-hand sides of an element. And in order to make that happen, in order to clear the left or the right, we're going to use the clear property. And we set the value as left, right, both, or none. So left is going to clear the left side, right is going to clear the right side, both clears both sides. Pretty self-explanatory, okay? Here in this example, we've cleared the left side for the element that's surrounded by the broken border, okay? All right, so we go back to Web Matrix, and I am going to take box 2, I'm going to delete these comments, and I'm going to add the clear left property here, okay? So I go back to my float demo, and I'm going to go ahead and hit right, and notice that we still have everything set as float left, but we still see both of the elements appearing as block level elements, right? And that's because for element 2, for block 2, I've gone ahead and I've cleared the left side of that element. All right, moving on. So let's talk about positioning, okay? You can position elements at specific points on a page using the position property. We've got a couple of different ways to do that. You can change the position property as make it static. You can make it relative, absolute, or fixed. Static is going to just simply position an element with its normal flow, just like you saw the box without any boxes without any modification. Relative is going to position an element in relation to where it would normally be positioned in the flow of content. And I'll show you what that means here in just a second. Absolute ensures that the positioning of an element doesn't impact any other content at all. And then fixed places it in relation to the browser window, and it stays in the same place the entire time. I'm actually going to exit out of my presentation here, and we're going to go to Bing. I'm just going to do a really quick search here for, early human species found. That's exciting. Going to do a quick search for CSS position property. You can find a lot of great tutorials on W3 Schools, and I'm actually going to go ahead and just resize this window real fast. So if we go back to our presentation here, we'll take a look at static first, okay? So if I take a look at a static element here, you can see that no matter where it's at on the page, it's going to just stay in its same order. Absolute, however, this div is positioned exactly where, exactly where it's supposed to be. So you see that it's positioned to the left, or from the left of the window by 10 pixels, and from the top, and this right here is being the window, okay? Now, if we look at relative, we've positioned it relative on the position of the screen. And then initial is something that we didn't talk about, and it won't actually be tested on the exam. All right, so let's head back to the presentation. And finally, we're going to talk about content overflow, okay? And this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because HTML is actually inside of something called a bounding box, right? So every single element occupies a rectangular space called a bounding box. And so you can think of text with a highlighted background on a Word document or a page as like being a bounding box, right? Where the highlighting stops is where the bounding box ends. And with CSS, you can modify the height or width of the bounding box. And if an element, or rather the content of an element, doesn't fit inside of it, then that content is called overflow. You can modify how the overflow is treated by using the overflow property in CSS. And here, we've actually set the overflow to something called visible. And I'll show you that here in just a second. First and foremost, though, let's talk about scrolling overflow, right? So sometimes you go ahead and you set all the content inside of a box, you have a ton of content that won't fit inside of your defined box, right? That content either goes nowhere, it overflows outside of the box, or you can set the overflow property to scroll, which creates a scrolling box as featured here in this right side of the window, okay? With visible overflow, you have the content goes outside of this light gray box and overflows. If it's hidden, then all of a sudden the content gets truncated and is completely cut off. And I'll actually just go ahead and show you all these different overflow values in the same demo. And I apologize, I forgot that I was going to do that. I set it up so that you guys can go ahead and copy all my CSS code here, and then go ahead and add go ahead and eliminate the other two that you don't want to demo yourself. But let's go ahead and go back to Web Matrix. And let's take a look at our overflow demo. All right, so I have a bunch of content here that I'll show you. I just have the lorem ipsum text, and you guys can just go ahead and do a quick Bing search for lorem ipsum, and you can just write text afterwards, and you can find all of this stuff. And it's great for being able to do a lot of web testing and just sort of honing your skills and sharpening your skills. So keep that in mind. But notice here that I've set it to scroll. And first, I'm gonna cut that for a second so you guys can see what this looks like without any modification. So I'm gonna launch this in the browser. So here it overflows, right? So it's visible as a default. So I'm gonna come back here and I'm gonna change the overflow property to scroll. So now I'm gonna come back to Internet Explorer, I'm gonna hit refresh, and all of a sudden I have a scroll box, which is pretty darn cool. Now, let's go ahead and set it to visible. Once again, we already saw that because that's the default setting for the overflow property, right? Looks exactly as we had seen before. And then now we're gonna go ahead and set it to hidden. Refresh the page, and all of a sudden it's hidden. So it's pretty quick and easy to handle overflow. It's really important that you make sure to do that because there'd be nothing more frustrating as a user than going and reading an article and seeing that the text is cut off. That'd be a pretty big nuisance, right? So keep that in mind. It's also a great way to go ahead and contain the, excuse me, manage the size of a bounding box and add scrolling as a feature in order to make sure that an article doesn't go too long on a page or that somebody doesn't have to scroll forever on a web page, right? You can just take a look at a section inside of a page and scroll through that just as easily as you would an entire web page. So keep that in mind. All right. So we're at the end of Module 4. As a quick recap for Objective 3.1, understanding the core CSS concepts, we talked about cascading style sheets, selectors and declarations, fonts and font families, content flow, positioning, and then content overflow. Thanks. It was great having you. I'll see you again in Module 5. Welcome back to Module 5 of HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. I'm Cullen, and we're going to get started right now with understanding CSS essentials. Focus on layouts and the user interface today, okay? So we're going to start off by talking about the UI, the user interface, the CSS box model, then move on to the Flexbox box model, a new feature in CSS3, and finally we'll talk about grid layouts. All right, without further ado, the user interface. The user interface is the portion of a web page that we interact with as users. There you see the Microsoft Virtual Academy website there on the right, a nice little screenshot. It's essentially the way that the page is laid out. Layouts range from minimalist with just a couple of elements here and there to more complex pages that are just jammed full of content. And I'd say that the Microsoft Virtual Academy is very cleanly developed, so I applaud whoever worked on it. It lies somewhere between the middle of a minimalist layout and something that would be more complex. All right, a quick note here. We're going to talk about some features that may or may not still be experimental based on the time of you viewing this video. As with HTML5, CSS3 is still in draft format, and so it might not be compatible with all browsers, so we have to use these things called vendor prefixes, right? These are workarounds for these compatibility problems. So what we have to do is if we're using a property name that is still experimental, we have to add a vendor prefix in front of it. Of course, that's what makes it a prefix, right? But it's simply a keyword that's surrounded by dashes, and we've got this nice little chart over here on the right to help you out in case you find anything confusing at all, right? Today we'll be using the Microsoft prefix since we'll be checking out our code examples on Internet Explorer. Let's talk about the CSS box model first. The CSS box model defines the rules for how content appears on a web page, right? So it's not just that we have text on a page, it's a lot more complex than that. And each element of HTML is a box that contains multiple components. Okay, so you have your content here on the inside. So this would be like a paragraph of text. And then outside that, but in between the content and the border is something called padding, right? So if you added border around an element, you can change the padding of the content in order to provide a little bit more space between the words per se and the border on the outside. And then next you have the margin. And the margin is really the area that sits between the element itself and another element. And we'll sort of experiment with this a little bit later, and hopefully I'll be able to show you a really good example that'll help it stick. All right, so let's go back and revisit block level and inline elements. So previously I talked about block level elements, and with the box model, block level elements create boxes that are a part of a page's layout. And so this is your headers, your articles, your sections. Paragraphs are also block level elements as well. And so we've got this nifty chart over here. Quite a few things we're familiar with. Block level, a good way to think of that is that if you add one of these elements to the page, it's naturally going to create its own line, right? Like it's going to be underneath the element previous to it, okay? Inline elements, on the other hand, are simply used to format content. And so this includes our elements like emphasis and maybe images, right? And then also links, you got the A tag there. Strong if you're trying to boldface something. Those are all inline elements. And so if you want them to appear on their own line, you would have to use the break tag, right? Jot out there. A little bit better than my last attempts at writing with my fingers. All right. And within this box model, we have, there are certain relationships that we have to pay respect to, right? It's called a parent-child relationship. Sometimes you'll place one box or one element inside of another, right? So nesting in HTML. And the outer box is referred to as the parent, which nests the child, right? So the child box is inside of the parent box. What's really important about cascading style sheets is that a child element is going to inherit CSS styles from the parent. Okay, what that means is that if we style a parent element to say have a blue underline, the child element is also going to inherit that style. Now, it's not the case for all CSS properties, but it is something that we do have to pay really close attention to and just be aware of in case we start styling wildly and we end up noticing some things that don't look quite right, okay? So there are a couple of problems with the CSS box model, and it's that some browsers are going to apply properties differently, right? So height and width are supposed to be separated attributes, but sometimes they aren't treated as such by older browsers. You aren't going to really stumble into this problem too often, but if it does happen, you definitely want to be aware of it, and you want to make sure that you're ready to handle it in your code, right?
This is all for this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will continue with Module 5 and learn grid layouts. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website and can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Million Lights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Million Lights. Thank you.